Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Marco on RC Nerd 74. In today's episode of my RC Scrappy build, I'm gonna go through the last steps before all the paint job and all the wrapping will be done. So it's all about the last steps on the wing build, on the wing tips, on the cowling lights and the wiring of all the light system, and then some small details like the wheel covers. So this is it, what will happen today. So let's jump right into the build steps and have a closer look. First, let's have a closer look to the last steps on the wing. One is to close the support holes for the slat control rods. For this I took XPS foam, cut it to shape and glued it in with odorless CA glue. To put it perfectly flat into the wing, I used a sand block. With this I could only push the foam down and the installation on the wing was perfectly flat. Then I sanded down the spots for perfect finish. And the next step was to close the vortex generator steps on the wings. Stock Carbon Cub has these vortex generators on the leading edge of the wing. Scrappy doesn't have these, so I wanted to close them. Did the same thing, cut it down, some XPS foam, glued it in with odorless CA glue, sanded it down to shape. Like this, the surface of the wing is perfectly flat and clean. Then I had to do some work on the wing tips. One was to do the extension on the rear end of the wing, which makes the wing the same length like the extended aileron and flaps. So I had to shape some carbon, glued it onto the rear end of the wing tip, which I had to sand down with a slight step of 1 millimeter to make these carbon fiber parts fit perfectly onto the wing tip. Then glued the carbon fiber on with 5-minute epoxy and filed the extensions to perfect shape. Then I started the work on the wingtip LEDs. To avoid any light in the foam wing, I used some Plastic liquid tape to cover the bottom side of the LEDs with black liquid tape, which helps to avoid any light of the LEDs in the wing. After liquid tape was cured, I glued the LEDs into the wingtips using 5-minute epoxy and glued the wingtips to the wing and sanded down the wingtips to the exact wing shape. There was also a hole on the rear edge of the wing from making the aileron horns because I had to cut into the wing, so there was a hole because of this. And I closed this with some cut off carbon cup foam, cut this foam to shape and glued it in also using odorless CA glue. To reinforce the wing around the outer servo for the slats, I took a carbon rod, cut it to around 15 centimeters of length. Like this, I wanted to avoid any weak wing issues around the hole I made for the slat servo. For the inner slat servo, there is no need for reinforcement because you have the wing support rods which keep the wing in place, so it's only the outer servo you have to reinforce to avoid any weak spot on the wing. Then it was time to wire up the wingtip LEDs. For this I took a 3S LiPo balancer connector. The 3S LiPo balancer connector works perfect for this job. You have 4 pins on this connector and you have 2 LEDs with each 2 pins. So like this you have perfect amount of pins to get a nice connection between the fuselage wiring and the wing wiring of the wingtip LEDs. For the wing shape, I wanted to have the stock wing support rods didn't fit well. They were slightly too long, so it was pretty tough to install them on the wing and the fuselage. I decided to shorten the support rods a bit. It's about 5 millimeters, just to slightly reduce the V-shaped wing to make the V shape of the wing come closer to the look of full-scale Scrappy. For this I drilled new holes and closed all the stock holes with 5-minute epoxy. I also had to modify the screws of the wing rod mounts and the tips of the support rods to make the modified support rods fit on the mounts. Because the slats are not super stiff, I wanted to avoid too much movement of the slats at higher speeds. For this I added some carbon supports at the tips on the second stage slats. For this I cut 1.5mm carbon plates to shape and glued them onto the slats using 5mm epoxy. Like this, the wind which pushes onto the slats doesn't change the shape of the slats at higher speeds. Then it was time to do the last steps on the cowling lights, on the landing lights. To keep the LEDs as cool as possible, I used heat sinks, which I cut off from the stock ESC of the Carbon Cup. Glued these cutted parts of heatsink onto the LEDs using heatsink plaster from AliExpress, which works absolutely perfect. Then soldered the whole wiring on the LEDs and glued them into the cowling using 5mm epoxy. And the final step on the cowling was to glue on the air intakes and air outlets. I glued them on with UHU Por. The reason for this is that they are still removable. The LED function check I did with 10.5 volts. Actually, these LEDs are made for 12 volts, but at 10.5 volts they are pretty bright already. So I can turn up the voltage to 12 volts if I like. I can do this on my step-up regulator. The maximum lumen they will have is 710 lumen each. So this is pretty super bright, but I think I don't use that much light for RC Scrappy. Then I did the final steps on the installation of all the electronics, wired up ESC, motor, light system, the final positioning of the step up for the cowling lids, shortened the motor wires. To solder the ESC and motor wires together, I used 3.5mm female bullet plugs for a strong and safe connection. Like this you can solder the wires on each side of the connector into the connector. Like this you have big surface which connects the wires with the connector. To make it easier to put a design on the rims, I made some rim covers of single layer carbon fiber. I made these single layer carbon fiber sheets using mylar sheets, so I could stick the dry carbon fiber onto one mylar sheet, put on some 24-hour epoxy, put a second mylar sheet onto the whole stack with all the 24-hour epoxy onto the carbon fiber, and put a lot of weight onto the stack. Like this you need no wax spray or similar to release the carbon fiber from the template, and you get a really nice surface of your thin carbon fiber plates. Then I cut off some excess from the carbon fiber sheets, draw the raw shape of the covers, cut the raw shape using a Lexan scissor, then drilled the center hole. Then I sanded down the covers to perfect round shape and the exact right diameter to fit on the rims. Then I painted the rims in black from the inner side of the rims, just to have a completely black rim from the inner side and from the outside. I also replaced the steel nuts of the rims with aluminum nuts. I will later replace more screws and nuts with aluminum hardware to reduce RC Scrappy's weight to the absolute minimum. To make the tail air intakes and outlets looks pretty on scale, I made some fake screws using 5mm epoxy. Then I put it on a layer of spray filler for a smooth surface. And for the nice look of the screws, I took Molotov liquid chrome marker to get the perfect look of the fake screws. Then it was time to assemble RC Scrappy for a first fit check of all the parts. All looks good so far. I also checked the CG, and to get a working CG I had to move the battery to the back of the fuselage opening. There we have no stock battery mount, so I made a custom battery mount using foam and carbon fiber plates to keep the battery perfectly in place at the rear end of the opening in the fuselage. I think like this I will hit a nice CG test flights will show how perfect I actually matched the needed CG. The battery mount lock is still missing. I have to wait for some ordered parts to finish the mount, but this will be a small step I can do during wrapping and painting of RC Scrappy. So this is it for the last build episode on RC Scrappy. I'm really looking forward to the next steps, which will be painting and wrapping the RC Scrappy. I hope to finally get a nice livery on RC Scrappy. So thanks a lot for following along. See you in the next one. Have a good time. Happy flying. Bye bye.